Now, just to finish up and open it up to discussion, I want to talk a bit about what I would consider to be a properly anthropological approach. I'm an anthropologist, and one of the things I study is religion. When I approach religion, my job, first and foremost, is to figure out what people believe and what that means for them. And so that means entering into the space, the intellectual space, conceptual space, the space of emotion and feeling that they inhabit, to the extent that I'm able to do that. This is an effort, in a sense, to bridge between an outsider's view and an insider's view. And in a sense, it's quite similar to what people do when they study, for example, Dostoevsky. That is, when you read Dostoevsky, at least in some stage of the project, you want to enter into that world that he creates. Now, you may want to do other things as you study his work as well. But one thing that's generally accepted, at least, is that in studying literature, we take as they're presented the intellectual, spiritual, emotional worlds that literature creates for us. And similarly, I think that an important step in understanding any religion is to try to understand that intellectual, conceptual, spiritual, and emotional world that it constitutes. And of course, as an outsider, there are limits to how much you can do that. That is, if I don't become a Muslim believer, for example, then one could say that there are things that I will never really understand about Islam. But I think that there are things that Muslim believers may not ever understand about Islam as it's understood and felt and experienced by other Muslims as well. I mean, there are always limits to intersubjectivity, that is, to the possibility of sharing the experiences that other people have. But the first thing I think that you have to do is to give it credit as something worth studying and taking seriously in its own terms. Then going beyond that, of course, one wants to know how it works in society, how it fits into larger cultural frameworks, and so on. And that also is something that can be approached, in a sense, from an internal perspective and from an external perspective. But I think that trying to do something of both is quite useful. And in this framework, I've been speaking about anthropology, but it should be noted that the same general idea can be applied to the study of religion in any context. And I think I would argue that it's essential for religious studies in liberal education generally, that you treat it, you accept it in its own terms, you accept diversity, alternative views, you accept that emotions are real things, that spiritual orientations are also very important and real for people. And then you take it in whatever direction further that you want to go in. And so the study of literature can also have a religious dimension to it, for example. I mean, it's hard to read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy without taking seriously the way that religion was important for them in the way that they wrote their works of literature. And the same is true in other fields as well. I think that it's a very unproductive thing to begin by studying, for example, fundamentalist Islam by saying, well, this is really all about trying to overthrow regimes. That is, there's many other things that are going on. And if people themselves are not constantly talking about overthrowing regimes, but also talking about what religion means to them, then you aren't really doing yourself a service in trying to analyze a religious movement, for example, even in political terms, if you fail to take into consideration what motivates them, what makes it important for them. So the general lesson that I would like to close on is that the liberal education, as Jambi was suggesting in her introductory remarks, is trying to broaden ourselves and to take things in their multiple dimensions, to have a multitude of different approaches, but to give each of those approaches its own integrity. That I'll close and invite your comments and questions. Thank you.
John Schoberlein, would be cultural national ideology in post-Soviet Central Asian nation building, the contested Islamic terrain in post-Soviet Central Asia, and Islam in secularizing societies, as well Central Asian security. So very important and urgent subjects for today. So now let me open the floor for your questions and remarks.
Particularly to hear John make his presentation to us as we, as a university, explore how to develop our curriculum. And in particular, this notion of the exclusion of religious studies from a curriculum appears absurd to those of us who believe that you need to study all aspects of the human condition in order to have a truly liberal arts university. The problem is that it gets sometimes touchy and we get vulnerable and we're really afraid to cross boundaries. We want to be respectful, and it's a very, very subtle area, okay? Whenever I read a poem, I read Robert Frost every day, I could tell you, go on and on for a while. I know he's either damning God or praising God every time he opens his poetic mouth. And God is terribly central to an understanding of who this poet is. And he's very ambivalent about God, and that is okay. And it is okay to talk about that in the context of learning. What we're struggling with, or at least I'm struggling with understanding, is how in this community one can approach religion and religious studies in a refreshingly open way, and in a way that allows us to be perhaps confessional, perhaps not confessional, but to be at the edge of those boundaries and feel safe and comfortable. That, to me, is the biggest issue that I think John is touching on very diplomatically, but it's really touching on, and I think it touches all of us in our hearts, and for one reason or another. And I just love to hear some people talk about that in the next half hour, one way or another. John's scholarly background is formidable, but what I love about his presence in our university is that he's so open to, I don't know what to say, informal discourse. So help me, everybody. Help us.
Skeptical that you can judge, even in a qualitative manner, much less a quantitative manner, any individual's relationship with God as an external examiner. What you can look at is practices, and you can try and infer from the practices the level of piety and the relationship with God between a community or individuals. But I don't see how you can, as an external examiner, say this group of people or this individual has this particular relationship with God, that this is the level of their beliefs. There's no way I see that you can do that other to infer from external practices that leaves you with kind of a Kantian dilemma that you have only kind of indirect evidence of what the actual world is.
You used the word judge, and I would not use that in what I'm doing. My task is not to make assessments or to judge what other people believe or do. And this image of levels of belief which you put forward, this is a very common secularist way of approaching religion, which I find very, very unsatisfactory. The question of levels of piety, for example, this is, I think, one of the terms that you used. And it's considered to be important because, for example, when a political scientist wants to figure out how likely people are to mobilize behind radical Islamism or something like that, or radical Christianity or whatever, they want to know, well, is this population pious? Are there strong believers? And assessing what a strong believer is extremely problematic.